A few months ago, my teenage nephews recommended I play Hollow Knight. They're good kids, and I've helped them through enough video games over the years that it seemed fitting that I actually give one of their games a try for a change. They've recommended games for me before, but Goat Simulator and Fortnite just don't get the juices flowing for me. Hollow Knight, however, is an entirely different story. As a longtime fan of the Soulsborne series, I've been hearing about Hollow Knight, at least peripherally, for quite some time, but I knew little about it aside from the fact that many had cited it as being similar to the works of From Software. Of course, I'd heard such praise lavished on games before, and have generally come away disappointed with what, to me, felt like pale imitations of those iconic titles. So when I first fired up Hollow Knight, I must admit I kept my expectations tempered. It didn't take long for me to have those expectations blown away. What I discovered was a game that not only effectively emulates aspects of the Souls games, but many other popular genres as well. Combine this with its wonderful art style, memorable characters, and interpretable story, and you've got yourself a game that is best described with a phrase unheard of in the gaming industry. It has universal, generation-spanning appeal, enough that everyone from children to teenagers to adult gamers can find both joy and fulfillment in the halls of Hollow Nest. The first thing I told my nephews after playing Hollow Knight for a weekend was that the game was clearly inspired by Dark Souls, so they shouldn't have doubted my ability to keep up with the game's difficulty. In response, they told me, "No, Uncle Albatross, it's a Metroidvania!" First off, touche, kids. But more importantly, I couldn't believe that they'd heard the term Metroidvania. For a minute there, I felt like Bane in The Dark Knight Rises, and got ready to tell these know-it-all kids, "You had merely adopted the Metroidvania. I was born in the Metroidvania, molded by it." But once I'd stopped being an old man, I quickly realized just how beautiful it is that because of Hollow Knight, my nephews now know that term at all. Because Metroidvania games are more than just a genre. They provide an experience that is unique to video games. Think back to the first Metroidvania game you ever played, or at least one with Metroidvania-inspired elements. For me, it was Mega Man X4, a PS1 game I played at the tender age of 4. Well, I didn't play it. I watched my dad play it and I cheered him on. Along the way, the beautiful mysteries produced only by the Metroidvania genre kept popping up. Sometimes it was a room we couldn't reach, a ledge we couldn't climb, but most of the time it was a boss my dad just couldn't figure out how to beat. It took us a while, but once we discovered that there was a recommended order in which we should fight the bosses, with a specific set of abilities one should acquire in order to progress, the game became much easier. As satisfying as these victories were, seeing the outcome of a mystery I'd been daydreaming about for weeks was even more rewarding. "How are we going to beat Web Spider, Dad?" "Well, kiddo, it's easy. We just gotta beat Slash Beast first." These same mysteries can be found in Hollow Knight. How will I ever scale this giant chasm? Gotta get the Mantis Claw. How will I ever make it up to that ledge? Better find the Monarch Wings. How do I dodge these ridiculously fast attacks? Well, you can either get good or get yourself a beautiful Mothwing cloak. So many games today are either multiplayer extravaganzas or linear epics. There's nothing wrong with these games, but neither of them afford the opportunity for exploration, for self-made mysteries to develop, for the player to see something difficult or confusing and decide they'll come back later, all of which are experiences that can be found in Metroidvania games. They essentially teach players to pop on a pair of aviators and say, "I'll be back." And honestly, that's not just an important video game lesson to learn, that's an important life lesson to learn. For younger players, it's an introduction to a video game language with a storied history. For older players, it's a welcome return to the formative experiences of our childhood. It's a beautiful blending of eras. An example of Hollow Knight's universal appeal to those who haven't experienced a Metroidvania yet, and those of us who grew up on them. Of course, I wasn't wrong when I described Hollow Knight as a Souls-like. It's got a similar death mechanic to Bloodborne, and that you need to defeat a shade to reacquire your Geo. Level designs that loop and latch together, and of course, challenging combat. There will come a day when I'll do an in-depth analysis of how Hollow Knight's DNA connects to the Soulsborne series, how the Dark Souls games influenced Hollow Knight, and how Hollow Knight, I think, in turn, has influenced Elden Ring. But for now, let's talk about what the game's difficulty does for both new and more experienced players. The majority of the linear epics I mentioned earlier have difficulty settings. For the record, I have no issue with this. The most you'll ever hear me wade into the Soulsborne difficulty debate is to say that I am a man of eclectic tastes. There are plenty of games, typically those involving guns for example, that I deliberately choose to play on a lower difficulty setting, because I have the ballistic skill of an orc. Shout out to any of you 40k fans who get that reference. But that's not something I'd ever think of doing with a Soulsborne game, because that's just not the experience I want out of it. I play Soulsborne games because I like dark fantasy, and I like to be challenged. I play Madden because I like football, and I like having something simple and mindless to do after a long day of work. I played Control because I liked the story, despite the fact that I couldn't shoot without an aim assist if my life depended on it. But enough about that. Regardless, for some players, Hollow Knight might be the first game they've ever played with a fixed difficulty setting, and thus, once again, it's introducing them to a new type of experience. This approach isn't for everyone, and I believe wholeheartedly that we should be accepting of that. It's why we have mods and invulnerability glitches. But for those who do crave a challenge, this is their opportunity to wade into that realm in an environment that is a bit more forgiving than your average Soulsborne. After all, late in the game, losing Geo was a small price to pay compared to losing souls. I don't know if my nephews will ever play the Soulsborne series, but I hope that if they do, that they'll find the similarities between those games and their beloved Hollow Knight to be somewhat welcoming. At least as welcoming as a game whose catchphrase is, "Prepare to die," could possibly be. The same was true for me in reverse. The euphoria of reaching a much-needed bench, finding the hidden pathways between areas, and the realization that I was going to have to actually learn and study bosses before I could defeat them, all told me that I was in the right place. This came to a head when I struggled to defeat the Mantis Lords, and realized, as I did with Lorien and Lothric years earlier, that I was just going to have to dig in and learn their moves. Now, I replay that boss fight in Godhome for fun. It's one of my favorite boss fights of all time, a bond I built through its challenging difficulty. Throughout my Hollow Nest Odyssey, my nephews asked for constant updates on my progress. What they really wanted to know was which boss would prove to be the one who'd stop me in my tracks, who'd make me throw my controller across the room in frustration. Along the way, they taunted me with the difficulty of bosses that they themselves had struggled with the most. To be fair, just about all of the bosses they warned me about were difficult to some degree. But by that point in the game, I'd already figured out how to bend the knight into a character that suited me. Despite him being a fixed character, the game's charm system is a brilliant way to give players a degree of control over his strengths. In this way, it blends the Sekiro approach, where the difficulty is controlled by the fact that there really is only one way to play the game, with the more varied approach to success from Dark Souls and its sequels. In Hollow Knight, this strategy meant the Deep Focus Charm, to double my healing but at a decreased speed, the Quick Focus Charm, to negate that decreased speed, the Grub Song Charm, to give me soul every time I got hit, and the Weaver Song Charm, which, when paired with Grub Song, gave me a pair of soul-collecting familiars. Later in the game, after I beat Troop Master Grimm and earned another charm notch, I added the Spore Shroom charm to the build, which allowed me to do damage after each successful heal. Altogether, it gave me a character capable of collecting massive amounts of soul, healing double, and doing area damage after each successful heal. It was a strategy that got me through the majority of the endgame content. Wow, you sure are fast, Mr. Bossman, and your moves sure are hard to dodge. But guess what? I can heal double, my minions are collecting boatloads of soul, and even if you hit me right after I get a heal off, I'm still gaining a net of 1 soul, and now you're bathing in a cloud of yellow poison. Good luck beating me, you lifeless AI! This strategy was so effective that it allowed me to defeat the Hollow Knight in an exceptionally short time frame. If I lined up the spores the correct way, I could do so much damage to him that he would never end up doing many of his signature attacks, most notably the slam. And just like that, Hornet was back in the arena, slamming her needle into his head and telling me to get through! At least, that's what I think she's saying here. Obviously, if you've played Hollow Knight, then you're probably wondering why I fought the game's namesake boss so many times. The answer is that the Radiance, the game's true final boss, proved to be my undoing. Suddenly, the custom hollow tank build I'd used to get through the game's most difficult bosses was utterly useless, due to the fact that every one of the Moth Queen's attacks deal double damage. No longer could I heal and take damage at a net gain. No longer was bathing my enemies in spore poison an effective damage dealer. At long last, I'd been bested. With no other option on the path to victory, I realized it was simply time to get good. To learn her moves, just as I had with the Mantis Lords and with the Twin Princes. After a while, I did, and was rewarded with a beautiful segment that I consider to be one of the best in all of video games. Ascending the platforms, dodging the Radiance's final blasts of light, while an army of shades follows you to the pinnacle so the Hollow Knight can assist you in delivering the final blow? That is some good shit. All of this is to say that Hollow Knight not only borrows from Souls techniques, but effectively reproduces the experience of overcoming difficulty that made those games formative experiences for me. At the same time, they preserved what makes those games a lot more malleable than some might expect. Build variety. As I mentioned earlier, I know what strategies work for me, and those strategies got me through everything from Dark Souls 1 to Elden Ring. Hollow Knight allowed me to do this, until the difficulty spike of its final boss said no. I can't fault Hollow Knight for this. A secret final boss encounter should be stuck behind a wall of opposition. But for while it lasted, a design philosophy that emphasized difficulty, but with the ability to choose the tools that suited me best, was really comfortable for me, in that it had already helped me outlast everything from Slave Knight Gale to the Nameless King. I also didn't mind repeating the Hollow Knight boss fight multiple times, as it's a delightfully epic, tragic combat encounter that, much like the Mantis Lords, is almost dance-like. He's also wonderfully designed, highlighting an artistic direction that is easily one of the game's most underrated selling points. Which brings me to my final point about the game's universal appeal: its art style and character design. Hollow Knight packages everything we've discussed, Metroidvania and Souls-like elements, into a beautifully designed world full of delightful characters, chief among them its protagonist. This drew me in from the beginning. Who wouldn't want to go around smashing some evil undead bug things while looking like an adorable little badass? It didn't take me long to realize that this was surely one of the reasons my nephews had gravitated toward the game. Shortly after playing it, my wife told me that many of the students at the middle school where she teaches are similarly obsessed with the game, many of whom mentioned that the art style was one of the first things that drew them in. But what I didn't expect was to find out in my very own home just how appealing that art style was to a wider audience. Towards the end of my Hollow Knight playthrough, my 4-year-old daughter wandered downstairs, took one look at the knight, and became instantly mesmerized. We've been playing video games together since she was a toddler, but we generally stuck to games with obvious hooks for kids. Games like Stray, Christmas Run, and LEGO Star Wars. For her to take an interest in Hollow Knight baffled me. But again, it speaks to the art style. The delightful characters drew her in, but as it turned out, the gameplay kept her there. For the last month, playing Hollow Knight with my daughter by my side has become a nightly ritual. I had no intention of beating the Pantheons. I think boss rush modes are great for replayability, but they're not really my thing. But since I was at the end of the game, with little left to do or to show her, I took her to Godhome to see the Hall of the Gods. She's found real joy in watching me defeat various bosses from the game, and loves when they show up in the Pantheons, especially Hornet. In fact, my daughter loves Hollow Knight so much that we were able to potty train her by using Hollow Knight stuffies as a reward. And in case you think I'm pulling a Ruth Kondo on this one, here's a picture of her ever-growing collection of Hollow Knight stuffies. I'm starting to run out of ones to reward her with. There aren't that many more out there. Some mornings, she wakes up and asks me if Silksong is out yet. She's always disappointed when I tell her that it isn't. And as us Hollow Knight fans know, she's not alone in feeling that way. Out of everything I've already said, I truly can't think of a more powerful sign of Hollow Knight's universal appeal than this. It's a game with the right mix of DNA to appeal to everyone, from teenagers, to Metroidvania heads, to Soulsborne fans, and even children. So where does this leave us? Well, waiting for Silksong, just like my daughter. I don't know what Silksong will bring, but if it can do the same thing as Hollow Knight, and bring together a wide audience thanks to its universal appeal, then I'll be happy to say that Team Cherry has outdone themselves once again. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. If this video does well, I'll definitely make more about Hollow Knight. It's an awesome game, and I'm always going to have a bond with it because of the fact that it helped me potty train my daughter. I really never thought I'd say that when I first started playing Hollow Knight, but that's a pretty incredible outcome. Video games, my friends, they can do some amazing things. Next up will be my monthly Night in the Woods video. After that, I'll have another general video game essay coming out. Not quite sure what game it'll be yet, but I've got a couple in mind. See you guys then.